As we continue with our study of the book of Genesis, we now come to the chapters 14 to 16, and we look at three major stories. First of all, we look at Abraham pursuing after those who had stolen his nephew Lot, and then we look at the struggle that Abraham has with wondering why he has not had any children yet, and a covenant promise that God makes with him. And finally, in chapter 16, the story of Hagar and Ishmael. The first of the three stories, in chapter 14, is set in a kind of a different context from any of the other ones. This is the only time, really, that we see Abraham in quite this major kind of a way, interacting internationally. Of course, he has gone down into Egypt and has had some troubles with the Pharaoh, but now these kings are kings who had come from the land of Shinar, which is the land that Abraham came from. As these people spread out and did their trade, they noted that there were various routes or paths that they could take as they were going from Mesopotamia down into Egypt. And it's important to recognize that much like today we'll have toll booths or something like that, and that a lot of castles were built in the Middle Ages at bends in rivers, that throughout time there have been people who have looked for a way to make money off of the trade and whatever would be passing through. And apparently the people who lived along the Dead Sea Valley were willing to give a portion of that amount to the people who were sending the trade, people back in Shinar who said, we guarantee in our country a place where people are able to make their money and we give the peace there, and we think we ought to get a benefit from what they are doing as well as they're transporting their goods. So for a good number of years, a dozen years or so, they were paying a portion of that money, and finally they said, why don't we just keep it for ourselves, maybe they won't bother us. So we have the 5 kings of the Dead Sea Valley against these 4 kings. A lot has been made of trying to find the individuals in any other kind of archaeological record, and that has not really been very successful to this point. The point that I think is more important here is that Abraham is portrayed as a very rich, well-to-do man. Part of the blessing, part of the promise that God had made, that he would make of him a great nation and that he would be very much blessed, the part of the goods was there. He has 318 servants. He is living amongst other people, but has made good enough friends with some of them that he can go to them and ask them for help. And so as the kings of those 5 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, the little city, are taken away along with Lot and all of the other people there, it is at that time then that Abraham finds out about it, and he pursues along with others to go and rescue his nephew Lot and Lot's family and all the rest of the people. As he does this in very typical style, it shows that because God is with him, that he has very quick success. On his way back, he has to make a decision. He makes a stop, first of all, in the city of Salem, which has almost always been understood, I don't know of any other interpretation, that that is Jerusalem. The city in ancient times, maybe even at this time already, is called Jebus, J-E-B-U-S, though some of the ancient records do talk about a Urushalayim as well. But as Abraham stops, he stops and goes to a shrine in Jerusalem, which of course later is going to be the capital city of the kingdom. And while he is there, he comes to Melchizedek, and he brings 1/10 of all of what he has taken as the spoils of war. Now, here's how it works. Abraham goes to rescue Lot and his family. Everything that those kings, Kedorlaomer and the others, had taken from those 5 cities and were taking along, all of the wealth, all of the possessions that these people had, now become Abraham's possessions along with those other men who went with him. So it is right and proper that Abraham could have been seen as simply becoming a new conqueror who was conquering those cities of the valley. Might remember when we get to chapter 19 and we look at the destruction of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, that Abraham, and by connection with Abraham, God, had been gracious to those kings. He had been gracious to those people. When they rebel and continue to do wicked things, it's not like they had not experienced an act of deliverance already. Well, anyway, Abraham could have kept it all, but he says, from the portion that I can claim, I will give 10% in worship, and I will tithe, and that's where the word tithe first shows up in the Bible, take a tenth. But he says, the rest of it I'm going to give back to you kings and your people. I don't want anyone saying that Abraham is rich because he has gotten rich off of those kings, off of those cities. And we'll note later that when fire and brimstone comes to destroy the cities, no one goes down to pick the remains of all of their wealth. That's all buried with them. As Abraham goes to Melchizedek, we remember the story that we've studied in the book of Hebrews already about this particular event and how Jesus is portrayed in a similar way as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Obviously, we don't know anything from chapter 15 about where Melchizedek came from. His name means, my king is righteousness. And the word tzedek, or righteous, might have been connected with the city of Jerusalem for a long time. This man, who comes from who knows where, is worshipped by Abraham, not worshipped, but Abraham goes to him and says, I worship and bring an offering to the God whom you serve. The God usually identified as El at this point, the word El being kind of the generic word for God. And as Abraham is there and brings this offering, he receives a blessing from Melchizedek and apparently from God at the same time. This also suggests to us that there were others who knew God and worshipped God. We have little hints here and there is about all, but they were not the people through whom a blessing would come. So we can't automatically assume that no one else knew God. We just plain don't know, but every once in a while here and with Moses' father-in-law, there seemed to be some ties with those who had also been brought into an awareness of who the true God was. As Abraham comes here then, the story that will be important for the book of Hebrews is that Levi, the great-grandson, one of the great-grandsons of Abraham, and the view was that all of your descendants are within your loins wherever you are, that Abraham would have had Levi there as well, in essence, worshiping at an altar of someone who was greater. When the book of Hebrews says, let's reject the Levitic priesthood and worship one who is even greater, one who we don't know where he came from any more than we know where Melchizedek came from, but one who is now pleading before God for our sins and to forgive us, that Melchizedek becomes a very helpful figure then, and is one that is seen as almost more of a priest and a king in both roles. That same concept is picked up in Psalm 110, when we're told that David is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and also then in the book of, that David is connected with Melchizedek, and then with the book of Hebrews that Jesus is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So Lot and his family go back their way. The other kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities go back home. Abraham goes back to his place, and he has actually not profited even one shekel from all of what he has done. But he still doesn't have any children. He's now been in the land for 13, 14 years or so, and he is troubled about this, and so he wonders before God whether Eliezer of Damascus, someone whom he must have picked up as a servant when he was on his way through Syria, could be, by adoption, his descendant, the one through whom the blessing could come. And we detect here, like we do with the story of Abraham down in Egypt, that human beings, even believers, and I would like to suggest here especially believers, who do believe that God has blessings in store for them, might still be troubled by the fact the blessings haven't come yet and might say we have to hurry the process up. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a goal and a purpose and try to understand how we are to serve God, but it might mean that everyone doing their task might still not see the results that one would expect. Some people will get very frustrated and simply quit. Others will say, let's come up with another scheme, some other way where we don't just use this one message, but we try and find some other way around the problem that God is having with the world. And the assumption is that God simply can't pull it off. Well, Abraham and Sarah have been trying to have children over 60 years. It hasn't worked yet, so something else must be done. Abraham suggests adopting his servant over the head of the household, and God says, no, I am telling you that you and your wife Sarah will have a child. Obviously, according to the next chapter, Abraham still didn't listen. But in ancient times, covenants were established by people having a meal, and so they would have a meal together, but then they would also take some animals, and they would split those animals right down the middle and lay those animals down on the ground, and everything except the doves are treated that way. And then the people would walk through between the pieces of the meat of the animal. The point was, if I break the covenant, if I go against what I have promised from my side, may I be split in two as that animal is, and may I be killed by the other person in the covenant. When God says, I make a promise to you, he says, I will do absolutely everything, even be split apart in two. Well, split apart in three, as it might be, rather than to break this covenant. But God says, I'm not breaking a covenant. I'll do anything to make sure it doesn't get broken. And since normally the two parties would walk together through between those and symbolically then act out what should happen to them by looking at what happens to the animals, Abraham is caused to fall into a very deep sleep, and God, in the form of this fiery pot, goes kind of sailing right on through between those pieces of meat and says, I am binding myself that I will not go back on my word. When we look at what happens on Good Friday, God takes the place and is then broken in place of the covenant partner who has failed in the covenant. But it's not just the covenant with Abraham that's failed, it's the covenant with Adam and Eve and God, with human beings and God, that was broken by us. And yet God is the one who takes the hit, who takes the hurt, who takes the brokenness, who is alive but dead really at that same time because of the sins that we have all committed. And so as Abraham then sees all the stars of the heavens and is told, you're going to have as many descendants as the stars of the heavens and as the sand on the seashore, he is then assured once again with the good news, what God says is going to happen is going to happen. Humans have this wonderful tendency of believing we have to figure out how it's going to work. And if we can't figure out how it's going to work, or we think it's impossible, then we sit down and wait. All the way through the scriptures, God says, no, you go on and act. Abraham was to continue to try and get his wife pregnant at this time. He is to continue to trust that God can do what he says he will. Abraham and Sarah consider this, and after a while Sarah says, well, I'm not going to have any children. God has closed my womb, so why don't you take my servant girl Hagar? Well, Hagar must have been picked up when Abraham and Sarah went down into Egypt, when he lied about his wife being his sister. And now this is a form of surrogate motherhood. In the ancient world, if a wife couldn't bear children, then very often the servants were taken, and pregnancies would come from that. We'll see with the story of Jacob that he has both Rachel and Leah, and also Bilhah and Zilpah, so the 12 tribes come from actually 4 different women. The only one who apparently has relations with only one woman from these first 3 will be Isaac. We're never told that he has any other consorts, or that Rebekah even brings a servant girl along. But now with the story of Hagar, once Hagar is impregnated by Abraham, then she laughs at Sarah and says, see, you're worthless and I'm really worth something. sort of proving the point in her mind that Sarah is the one who must have done something wrong and God is punishing her, and that's why she can't have children. Uh, at this point, Abraham hears the rage and sees the rage of Sarah, and Sarah says, I can't take it anymore. And Abraham says, well, she's in your hands. Do with her as you please. And she says, I'm going to send her away. Well, Hagar then, in her despair, in her pregnancy, goes away and expects that she's going to die. God says to her, you go right back where you came from. Sends a message to her somehow, and she even calls the place the well where I saw God. And she goes back to Sarah, and she is obedient to her. Of course, this is the beginning of the story of Ishmael, the story of the Arab peoples, and is the real beginning point for all of the kinds of struggles that we see in the Arab-Israeli conflict, because Abraham is seen in the scriptures as the father of both Ishmael and Isaac. Now, God had said, through Isaac your descendants are going to be named, but there is also the assurance here that Ishmael will also be blessed. And thus we cannot say, well, one is chosen and therefore the other can be destroyed or punished. God would say, I will give one blessing to the one I choose to do this task, another blessing that I will choose to give to the one who does this task. And whether people react and rebel against God and go their own way doesn't mean that the heart of God isn't such that he would like to have these blessings come. So we have the story now of Hagar and Ishmael. As I've mentioned at other times, the idea was in ancient times that the man was responsible for providing the seed, and that the woman was the place where the seed would grow, that there was not an idea at this time of the unity of sperm and egg. So one might say, well, what's the difference whether the seed grows within Abraham's wife or in her servant girl? The terminology that's used in terms of law would be that she bears a child on my knees. That's what Sarah would say, almost as if Hagar would sit on Sarah's lap when she's going to have a baby, and the baby would be seen as coming out almost as if it's coming out of Sarah. At least the information that I have says that until modern times, when they did autopsies on female cadavers, it still wasn't understood what the union of sperm and egg was all about and what the ovaries were. Until that time, everyone apparently thought that it was this other kind of a system. Well, the point is that here we're looking at times when God is still faithful. He blesses Abraham. He helps Abraham rescue his nephew Lot. He assures him that there will be a promise and that everything that he said will come true. And yet, both with the story of Eliezer and with the story of Hagar, we find Abraham distrusting. Well, God reckoned to him as righteousness that he had acted. God didn't say, if you're not perfect, I'm going to reject you. He hangs in there with him. He loves him anyway. He says, I'm going to continue to do what I said I would. But he reckons it to him as righteousness, not as a kind of a work where Abraham did something and then God blessed him. Remember that the blessing of God comes already in chapter 12. He reckons to him as righteousness. He says, I'll treat you in the way that I've been treating you, and I call you to respond in the right way to me. For us as well, we're called not to change the rules, not to come up with something that we think makes good sense, but to recognize that God does give us the encouragement and the strength and the help to stay faithful at proclaiming the good news as he's given it, not to change the rules or minimize the body of Christ into simply a holding operation, but to remember that we are out in a world that the Lord has indeed redeemed. May God strengthen all of us as we continue our study and as we reflect on times when we have turned from God and as we ask God to help us to stay faithful to him. God's blessings to all of you, and thank you for continuing this study.